In this video, I wanted to talk about View C of the Tiffany Thomas pattern. This is a smocked from the shoulder pattern, so I have pleated 16 rows here. You'll get your blocking guide out for this view, and what you want to do is on one side flatten those pleats out so that when you align the top of the guide to the top edge of the fabric and the side of the guide is to the side of the fabric, and I'm putting it to the side right here where the selvage is because I won't be using that selvage, then you want to trace out your armhole curve. Now for the 3-month size, it's recommended that you pleat 14 rows. I've pleated 16 rows, so that's 2 more than required, but I just wanted to see how that would work out. Now once you've got the general curve in here, you want to go to the point where it's furthest in from the side of the fabric, and you want to measure in your 1/4 inch seam allowance, and that would be at this pleat. So at that point, I pull out all the pleats at the same spot on the fabric. Now you could just leave this all tied off and smock all the way to the edge. That works just as well, but I kind of prefer this method some of the time, and so that's what your instructions are going to call for. You can see when you do that, when you get up here to the top, you're going to have a little section where there's no smocking. So your 1/4 inch seam here and your 1/4 inch seam there. There's this little area that won't have smocking. Now, I did not find that to be noticeable at all or distracting or an unpleasant look. But again, if you prefer to have it smocked all the way, then go ahead and leave your pleating threads all the way to the side of your fabric. Just pick out your 1/4 inch seam allowance, and that way you don't have that issue there. But again, I did not see that that was a problem in the dress that I smocked. And then you're going to tie your threads together. I usually do groups of 3. Some people prefer to do groups of 2. Whatever works best for you is fine. So you're going to tie off the one side, and then you're going to do exactly the same thing to the other side. So I get the one side tied off, and then the last group here is going to have 4. And then I take my threads on the other side and just will pull the pleating threads so that the knot snugs up against the fabric. Now for this, I also pleated more width than the 35 inches that is suggested for this size, and that is because I just want to see how tightly packed the pleats are and what it looks like after I get this tied off, or gathered up, I should say, because the width of your fabric can change depending on the fabric that you're using. This is a broadcloth weight fabric. If you were using something like a Swiss batiste or a voile, you may decide you want all the pleats in and so use the whole 45 inch width. Whereas if you were doing a flannel twill fabric, you might not need, you may not even need the 35 inches. But I wanted to see what this looked like before I just determined to pull it out. This is my pin marks where the 35 inches for the width is marked off. So now when I lay my piece on here to kind of get a visual, you can just determine how tightly packed you want your pleats to be and how full it wants to be, and at that point you can do the same thing. Flatten this second side out, draw your curves in and then pull it out and pleat this fabric up. So now I have flattened out the second side of the fabric here where I have determined I would like my pleats to stop, and I'm drawing in my armhole curve on this side of the fabric. You don't really have to draw the shoulder seam in. I just do a little bit of the ways of that. And again, I'm going to measure in 1/4 of an inch, and that'll be about this. That's your seam allowance. You don't need to have your pleats in the seam allowance. And now I'm going to pull out the extra pleating threads on that side of the fabric. I did not want all that fullness in there. And I use a tapestry needle. I don't know what size that is. It might be an 18. The nice blunt edge allows you to slide underneath your pleating threads and pull them out. You can also just use the eye of your smocking needle and do the same thing. But you don't want to use the point. Then you'll just run into trouble. Okay, so with that side pulled out, I typically will tighten this up, and then once again lay your guide back on, and this needs to come in a little bit closer. Okay, so now I have my guide. Let's see if I can move this over so you can see. I have my guide aligned with the right hand side, because that's the first side I tied off. And now I'm going to align the guide with the second side. Okay, so that means I need to tie my threads off at this point. And I don't worry about distributing the pleats evenly here. You can do that after it's tied off. If you try to do it at this point, it's a bit tricky. So to tie off threads, I usually make a big overhand loop. Then you can stick the loop through a pin and into the fabric, and that will pull the knot right up to the fabric. I found that to be the best method for getting an accurate measurement when you're tying off inserts or bodices, whatever. Okay, so now I have the second side tied off. I usually give all the threads a good tug to make sure the knots are tight. And now you can spread your pleats out. And I will cut off all the extra threads. I'll cut off the extra fabric, so you only want to cut it even with the outside edge here. But now it's ready to smock, and I will come back after some or all of the smocking is finished and move on to the next step. So I have tied off the front of this dress. I counted pleats and I marked my center front, and I marked it not only at the top but also a little further down so that when you cut the neckline out I won't have to count again to find the center. I haven't got it completely smocked yet because I'm on a bit of a time crunch, and I wanted to make sure you got these finishing videos before I have to take a 2-week break. So I'm going to do it with just the top area, which I have back smocked. I have my front bodice piece here, and I have traced it out on the freezer paper. Freezer paper has a waxy side on one side and then a more paper side that you can write on the other side. I have taken the freezer paper and I will align the top of the freezer paper with the cut edge of the skirt front, and I'll align the sides with both of the cut sides of the piece of fabric and make sure that the center lines are aligned. And then I will just press this with a warm iron, and that will allow the freezer paper to stick to the fabric. Then I'm going to stitch with a 1.5 stitch length all around the shape of the bodice, and then I will trim away the extra. And you would use this same method even if you smocked all the way to the edges, you know, just leaving your 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I've done that with garments like that as well. So I'm gonna iron this on and get my stitching finished. So I have stitched all around the bodice here with a 1.5 stitch length. Then I cut away the excess fabric from outside the stitching line, and now I'm ready to proceed with the construction of this garment. Now typically when I construct this way, I will leave the paper ironed onto the bodice until after I stitch the seam that I'm working on. So for instance, I would stitch the shoulder seams, and then I would peel the paper away from the shoulder, from inside the seam allowance there. And then if I were doing the flat construction method, I would sew the sleeves into the armhole and then peel that off. And then depending on whether I'm having the collar or not the collar, I usually wait to peel the paper off the neckline till the very end. It's a little bit awkward doing it that way, but I feel like that way it ensures that nothing gets stretched out, even with the stitching line in there. You have two choices with this method. You can have a collar with the smocked from the shoulder, and that looks real sweet, but you can also have just a bias band finished around the neck, and I like that look as well too, particularly if you have a more intricate smocking design that goes up to the shoulder. A collar would cover that up. You could see on this outfit, I made sure that the smocking design mostly fell below the collar point here. So that's a consideration if you plan to put a collar on. If you're putting a collar on, you leave this stitching line where it is. However, if you plan to put a bias band around the neck, you need to trim away that seam allowance. So you would need to stitch again at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and after stitching that second time, you're right on your seam allowance, you would trim out the excess fabric on the seam allowance. And you need to do that to the back yoke as well. That seam allowance also needs to be removed, because with a bias band, this finished edge is at where the seam allowance is. So if you forget or neglect to trim off your seam allowance, your neck hole opening is going to be too small. So depending on which method you prefer to use will determine whether you trim off any more here or not. And then at that point, the remaining construction is exactly the same for the sleeves and for the collar as it is for all the other views. If you're going to finish it with a bias band trim, obviously you would use a bias band and stitch your 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then turn it in on the inside and whip it down by hand. And I added a little lace trim. You can do that. You don't have to. And just as a point of reference, you do the same thing if you're going to finish the top with entredeaux and lace. I wouldn't probably use entredeaux and lace as a finish with the smocking, because that would be a little bit too heavy in my opinion. But for this lace bodice that I used, I did trim the neckband with entredeaux and lace, and for this you also need to remove the seam allowance because the entredeaux is stitched at the seam allowance. So you have all the information. You can go ahead and finish this view also with your little Tiffany Thomas. So I think I've covered all the different aspects of this diaper set as far as the shirts are concerned, I'm still undecided whether I'm going to do the diaper cover because that's pretty straightforward and simple sewing. So I hope you've enjoyed this little series, and hope you'll join me when I do the next sew along.